Okay, the Lowell specials or the work session for February 29th at 6:01. Roll call, please.
Mayor Betts.
Here.
Councilor Harris.
Here.
Councilor Stratus.
Present.
Councilor Weathers. Here. Councilor Murray.
Here. Okay, we're all here, and why don't the people over there that kind of start up here and go on down, introduce yourselves. That way we'll know, the people out there will know who we're talking to and who they're listening to.
My name is Matt Wadlington. I'm with Civil West Engineering. We're the contract city engineer for the city of Lowell.
Go ahead.
Max Baker, Public Works Director, City of Lowell.
Greg Taylor, I'm a fish biologist for the Corps of Engineers, and I'll be your speaker tonight.
Kelly Wingard, I am the current in a detailed temporary position as the deputy operating project manager for the Willamette Valley.
And I'm Dustin Banks, and I'm the operations project manager for the Willamette Valley and Road Basin projects for the Corps of Engineers.
Glad to have y'all. Okay, we ready for the Corps of Engineer presentation at this point, or you have certainly put the lead in? Okay, whichever one's going to go first.
Yeah, it's gonna be. Well, thank you for having us tonight, and look forward to an opportunity to give you more detail on these drawdowns. I know everybody in the room is probably familiar with them at some level, has either been affected by them or whatever. And I'll go into a lot of detail tonight, and what I really hope to do is answer your questions at the end of the day, give you information, and hopefully answer as many of those questions as we can. So a little bit of background. And Chairman, we can advance in 2 slides. I think the first point to make is to understand that the action that we're taking in this drawdown has been driven by litigation. And I don't point this out to hide behind the litigation. That's not the point of that. The point is to understand that there was litigation brought in August of 2018. And we lost under the Endangered Species Act. That's the bottom line. And so the plaintiffs that brought the suit were then entitled to some remedy. And we worked through a process, and at the end of the day, the judge issued an order. It ended up being a set of actions that we were required to take under the law. And that's really critical because these actions are not discretionary. They're not a set of actions that we get to make decisions around or decide whether we're going to do them or not. If they were in the order, the way they were in the order, that's what we had to carry out. And the drawdown here and in other places falls in that category. And I think that's why I like to kind of give that history, because it's really critical to understand sort of the non-discretionary nature of some of these actions. So you can put these, we call them injunction measures, but they're just actions that we're taking to operate the dams in a way to improve conditions for fish. And really the focus of the things that we're doing for fish are really around fish passage and water quality at the end of the day. When you really look at all the different actions that we're taking, they kind of come in 2 flavors. One is, and this is a small fraction of them, are structural measures. We're building something at the dam to try to make something better for either fish passage or water quality. You can imagine there's few of those actions. Why? Well, because generally those are really expensive, and generally that takes a really long time to do. So most of what we're doing under this injunction, which is a 2-year injunction scheduled to finish in December 31, 2024, are these operational measures. In other words, we're taking the dam, the existing infrastructure, and we're operating it in a way to try to improve conditions for fish. And I'll spend a lot of time kind of talking about the different pieces and parts of Lookout Point Dam, and how we're doing this drawdown based on that. But that's really critical to understand that because this is remedy, and because we've got this relatively short timeline, the lion's share of things that we could do immediately were with the existing infrastructure and kind of reoperating the dam. You're not gonna, there wasn't a lot of things like, oh, well, just go build the downstream fish passage structure. And then operate the dam like you always have. That wasn't in many, under the injunction, wasn't really on the table. That's a long-term possibility, and it may be something that we do down the road in some cases, and we'll talk about that towards the end of this. But again, kind of the take home on these measures is they're operational largely. We're taking the existing infrastructure, we're using it differently and trying to improve conditions for it. The drawdowns fall into that category. We have spill, so let's go to Lookout. If you've been here in the summer in the last decade, you've seen the spillway gates operate at certain times of the year. More so than they ever did. I've worked with the Corps for 23 years. Prior to that, I worked for ODFW, so I've been in this basin for 25, 26 years. Yeah, you didn't see the spill gates Lookout operate all that often historically. And so we have used those gates, and we are using those gates under the injunction. And those, that's an example of one of these operational measures that we're carrying. The drawdowns themselves, we've got 4 of those that we're carrying out across the basin. Cougar, it's a relatively small scale drawdown. You can see some of the numbers associated with these. So that's a 27-foot drawdown in the wintertime. Fall Creek, I think people are probably more familiar with that. We've been doing a drawdown at Fall Creek, believe it or not. The first drawdown at Fall Creek, and I don't think a lot of people understand this, was in 1966. That's a year after the dam was in place. So we have a long history of operating that project with these types of drawdowns. In recent years, we've been doing what's called a full stream bed drawdown. So, and I'll contrast that with what we do at Lookout, but that we're literally taking the pool all the way down to stream bed, and then the water's moving through the dam directly downstream. At Lookout Point, we're doing a 75-foot drawdown. That's below our normal set point in the winter, and I'll kind of talk you through some of these numbers on some future slides. That's targeted for mid-November through mid-December, and we'll talk about how that played out at Lookout this year. And so those, and we're doing the same thing at Green Peter. Green Peter is 142 feet below its normal winter set point. These are really significant departures from how we've historically operated the dams. Very, very different than things we've done historically. And, again, I touched on this already a little bit, but this, because we lost this case under the Endangered Species Act, and the judge found irreparable harm to these species, we needed to take these measures to improve fish passage and water quality. And the drawdowns were a tool, of which there's very few, and I'll walk through that next, that we could use immediately with the existing infrastructure. It's not the only tool that's out there. We'll touch on that towards the end, but it is kind of the tool that was available to do something right away. Timelines, we'll talk a little bit about this, both the durations and the timelines. I'll touch on these details in more detail in future slides, but they're 1-month drawdowns at the target elevation. Now, it takes a long time to get down there, so you're going to notice it much further back than that. And then we have a requirement to do these while the injunction's in place. And again, we expect the injunction to be in place through the 31st of December 2024. So if the question is, are you gonna do this drawdown this year? The answer is yes. Yes. It's a requirement under the injunction to do the drawdown again this coming year. Talk about that. So let me give you some, let me orient you a little bit here. And then I want to talk a little bit about why we're doing this for fish and sort of the mechanics behind it, how it works, and just give you a better sense of why this tool and not some other tool. Why don't we just do something else, right? So what you're looking at is you're looking at the back side, so the reservoir side of Lookout Point Dam right now. And with no water. Okay. And what you can see, and I wish I had a pointer, is that you can see over to the left and relatively high up on that dam structure are the backside of our spillway gates. That's our spillway gates up there. They're relatively high in the reservoir. Yeah. To the right, all the way to the right and down. Those are the penstocks for the turbine units. And then the structures to the left, they're all kind of one next to each other, and there's 4 of them there, are the regulating outlets. Why am I telling you this? We have to use what we have as infrastructure to do this operation. And the way the operation was designed is based entirely on what's there. And that is kind of the key. And so understanding that we have spillway gates that are very high, a turbine unit that's pretty deep, a regulating outlet that's even deeper, and how many of them we have and where they are, that all really plays into ultimately how the drawdown was put together and why the drawdown was put together the way it was. So I want to paint that picture first, keep that in your head, and then I'm going to walk you through just this set of, can you go to the next slide, Jim? So in the springtime, we have an operation we're doing where we're spilling water over the spillway. And as we just saw, the spillway is pretty high up in our pool. And I think, and I'll talk about the rule curve and how we fill, but I think many of you understand that we fill these pools generally in the summer, and then they're drawn down in the winter for flood control. These fish are the juvenile fish that we're trying to pass downstream, which are juvenile spring chinook salmon, are surface oriented. So they live in the top 0 to 50 feet, primarily. And so when the pool is up and we've got the spillway gates available to us, we can pass those fish through the spillway gates. But as we start drawing the pool down, Jeremy, next slide. As we draw the pool down in the fall and in the winter for flood control, spillway gates are not available to us. So now there's essentially 2 locations that we can pass water and fish at this point. One is a turbine unit, the 3 that we have there, and we showed that picture, and then the 4 regulating outlet gates. For here's fish biologists, I can say this: not all turbine units are bad for fish. The one at Dexter has actually pretty high survival associated with it. But the ones at Lookout are what we call high head Francis units. And they have very poor survival. That's the bottom. And if I was to put a round number on it for you, it'd be like 50% of the fish they go through. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. So if they're a big fish, that number is going to be a lot higher. If they're a really tiny fish, they actually do a little bit better. But the point here is that you have 2 routes, and one of them is just not a safe route for fish. So what does that like? Well, it leaves the regulating outlet. So then the question is, well, if the fish are going to use the regulating outlet, they got to find it. They have to find it, and so, what we know about these juvenile fish is they really don't find it and very effectively unless they're relatively close to it. Well, what is that? Well, 100 feet from that intake, will some fish find it? Yeah, because anywhere you put water, some fish will find its way there in that water and find its way out. It's just, I mean, if you put water there, a fish will find its way out, but we don't see very many fish pass with 100 feet. So in the wintertime, when we're at our normal set point, you know, it's about 100 feet to that regulating outlet. And so do we see fish pass? Yeah, we see some, but very few. And so really, it takes, you got to be down within 50 feet before you see any meaningful numbers of fish pass. And then the reality is you really need to be about 25 feet to see really effective fish passage. And so when it came to this drawdown and, well, why'd you choose 75 feet below the minimum set point? That's really it. It's that from the normal minimum conservation pool to that regulating outlet is 100 feet in the wintertime. Fish can't find it, even though it's a safe route. And so you narrow that up to about 25 feet, and that's where the 75 feet came from the drawdown. That's the rationale. And that the other route that you have at that time of year is the turbid. So this is like critical. If I didn't do a good job explaining this part of it, you're not gonna understand any of the rest of it. So it's really critical that this makes sense to you. So I'll stop and pause. Are there questions about that? Anybody confused about the why of the drawdown or kind of how it was decided? Okay. Well, they're being nice to me.
Good job.
It's understandable, totally understandable, yeah, there might be questions, but yeah.
Okay, here we go.
Was there any kind of a study accomplished prior to this? Or did the judge arbitrarily say, this is what we gotta do?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So on the fish passage piece of this, we've been studying fish passage at this dam since it went in, really. We published a number of papers on this in the mid 2000s, like around 2010. And that's where kind of this getting pretty close to the regulating outlet, or any outlet, it doesn't matter what the outlet is, whether it's the turbine unit or the regulating outlet, is all based on previous data that we collected for a long time. Now, the actual operation itself and the way that process worked, and it's good to kind of walk through that, was the judge, for some of the injunction operations, those were spelled out. But there was some of them where, how would a judge know, right? How a judge technically couldn't know what to do, right? Necessarily. So he appointed an expert panel. Now, people will laugh. Be careful when you laugh, because I was on that.
But you put yourself in quotes.
I did. Yeah, I don't think
Right.
that terminology. I don't, you know, he needed somebody, some technical advisors, right, to help design the operations and some of the technical aspects of the operations. So that's really what that group was sort of tasked with, is taking things like, well, improve the downstream fish passage in the wintertime at Lookout Point. Okay, well, this is why I just walked you through the cartoon. The only way to sort of improve.
For and no response for cardiac arrest at 38903 Rogers Lane, Crossbike, that's map page 14, C Charles. This will be on E3. As Battalion 21, Wool Battalion 23 with medic 4 at no response for cardiac arrest at 38903 Rogers Lane, Crossbike. That's map page 14, C Charles, E3 at 8020.
Thank you for the free entertainment.
So. I lost my train of thought a little bit there.
Talk about the feelings.
The panel, the judge said improved down here good passage in this. So then the panel went through this process, right? Well, we can't use the spillway gate. Turbine unit's got high, high mortality. So we gotta use the regulating outlet. Well, how are fish gonna find the regulating? We're gonna drop the pool. And so that's, that panel is, just so you're clear, had two folks that were essentially experts that the plaintiffs hired. Okay. Two folks from the National Marine Fisheries Service, who's the agency that's kind of charged with managing the endangered species and the endangered species. And then two Corps of Engineers employees. I was one of them. We had another employee who's a water quality person. Captain Tackle that also was part of that process. So our job was a bit different, I would say, than the other panel members, in that really our focus was to make sure that the other panel members sort of understood the technical aspects of the dams. Where are these outlets? How do they function? Those kinds of things. What are the dam safety issues? What are the, we got to make sure that we do flood damage reduction. We're not giving that away, all these other things. And so kind of bringing all that to the table, along with our knowledge of how this kind of system works. And so that was the role we played. Does that answer your question?
Good enough, I guess.
Yeah.
Just very briefly, who exactly were the plaintiffs?
Yeah, so the plaintiffs, there was 3 groups. They were the Northwest Environmental Defense Council. Hope I'm getting that right. Wild Earth Guardians, to this day, I still don't know who the Wild Earth Guardians are. And then the third one is the Native Fish Society. Those were the 3 entities that brought us in. So environmental groups. All right. Any other questions?
I have one.
Sure.
When you draw it down, then you can't make electricity over there at all.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes, so if we look, let's go back to that. Yeah, so that's the other key thing. There's a point at which where the pool comes down that you can't use the penstock and the turbines either. So yes, it actually happens pretty quickly, pretty early in that drawdown process. It's only like 5 feet below the normal set.
Question, when you say you're monitoring the fish coming over, do you have devices up at the spillway to see what's coming through there? Okay, is it a visual or is it some kind of thing? What's the mask?
I'll talk about, I have a slide that in and I'll talk about it. It's to paint that picture. There's not a single method that works. You gotta have multiple methods to really be able to understand what the fish are actually doing. So we will definitely talk about that. Let's talk about, we've hit this a bit, but let's talk about the actual drawdown itself. So okay, I'm gonna hit this again. You got to work with what you got, right? So we painted this picture once, we'll paint it one more time. Spillway gates up high. Our units, penstocks off there to the right. They're well below the normal set point in the winter, and then the deepest ones are our regulating outlets over on the far left. So let's talk about the drawdown itself and just how that kind of played out. So want to orient you to this as well. This is what we call a water control diagram. You may also know it as a rule curve. A couple key points to this thing. What this is, each dam has one of these that's specific to a dam. So Lookout has one, Dexter has one, they all have one. And then they operate as intended when you can see that what they're showing is the reservoir elevation, okay, on the y-axis, vertical axis, and then date on the x-axis. And the red line you can see is we keep these normally in the winter time, so in December and January, are pools that are our lowest. So if you're familiar with how these pools typically operate, they're down at their lowest elevations. That's why when you drive down Highway 58, you're like, you see all the stumps and all, I mean, that's for what? That's for capturing floodwaters. We're living it today, right? It's a lot of water coming in right now. And then they start to refill on February 1st. See that? And then they fill by roughly mid-May, stay as full as they can, and then they start drawing down in the fall as the flood risks start to increase. So that's classically how each of the Willamette projects work. And each of the diagrams is a little bit different for each project, but that's generally how they work. Other key thing is we can't be above that line for the time of the year. We can be below it, but we can't be above it unless we're taking a very specific action. And that specific action is we're actually capturing water to keep control points downstream of the dams from flooding. So we can go above the rule curve. I mean, otherwise you wouldn't benefit from having that space, right? If you weren't going to capture that water. So this is really important because I want to provide you some context for what the drawdown actually looked like in comparison to kind of the typical rule curve operations that we carry out. Let's go to the next one. So take what you just saw there, and that red line on this graph to the left is the rule curve for Lookout Point. Okay, so and then you can see the time of the year on the bottom. The blue line up there, just a little bit hard to see from here, is what we did this year in actual operations. So you can see we came up, held it at a certain elevation, and then drew the project back down. And that's why I say this is a dramatic departure from how we have typically operated, right? And so let me walk you through this just a little bit more. So I mentioned that we were using the spillway gate for fish passage in the spring. Well, that's the spillway gate is at elevation 887. So if you draw a line over where that blue line was, you can see we're just above elevation 887 in the spring. And we're holding that. We're spilling water out there to try to pass juvenile fish out. That's what's going on there. Okay. Now, under the injunction, we actually can store additional water after we spill for a certain duration in the spring. And if we have enough flow and stored water coming in, we could accumulate additional storage. We didn't do that this last year, but in a year that's wet for an extended period of time, especially in the spring, late spring, we could accumulate more water. So it's not impossible to see the pool go up from that elevation. But that elevation is this operation is one of the injection operations. Now, to accomplish this drawdown, which is 75 feet below that minimum conservation pool, that normal set point in the winter, which is in this case is 824. We had to get going early. We were drawing the project down at about 1 foot a day. And we did that for a very specific reason. There were some concerns about whether the drawdowns could impact historic landslides that were up in the reservoirs and some other things. So we're using this very specific drawdown rate to accomplish. What that meant is what you see there, getting going pretty early to evacuate all that water over that period of time to ultimately get down to the target elevation by November 15th. Hold it for 30 days and then bring it back up. Now, what would affect that? As you can see there, the black line is the plan, or the brown line there, but the blue line is what we actually did. So what you can see there is we got down a little bit early. So we made it before the 15th of November, down to the target elevation here at 750. And then the pool came up dramatically. before this operation was scheduled to be over. And if you recall, back in early December, around the 2nd and 3rd of December, we had basically 3 atmospheric rivers that came in back to back to back. And so what you see us doing there is capturing that water. And that was allowed. That was allowed under this injunction operation as designed. And that's what we did, because we were going to protect people downstream and ensure that we didn't have flooding or reduce flooding to the greatest extent possible downstream. So that's sort of a visual. And the other thing, important point here is that at this point, you kind of now can follow the curve out later this year. We captured a bunch of water. This operation now, the drawdown itself from this last year, is going to have 0 impact on what we do for reservoir refillation. 0. And the reason that is that, remember, we wouldn't have started filling until February 1st in any given year. Okay, so the fact that we are already on or above the rule curve now means this operation has had no impact whatsoever. Now, had we lagged and had a hard time filling and it had been really dry and we were sitting well below the normal set point in the winter, that would be an impact. That's not what happened this year. And we don't expect that's going to be in effect in our state. All right, questions about this drawdown? 75 feet below the minimum conservation pool, had to start early to evacuate all that water out. Couldn't just start, 2 weeks before we had to get down here. We're supposed to keep it down for 30 days. In actuality, it stayed down for about 30 days because we got there here early. We started back up early because the atmospheric rivers, that wasn't planned. It's just how it played out. Of course, now we're going to start talking about some of the, impacts associated with this drawdown. I think, those of you that like using the reservoir in the fall, we lost the boat ramps, relatively early this year. So it was about in late August, early September, we lost those. And you can see, kind of where that occurred. That our lowest boat ramp there is up here at Signal Point. It's at just about at the normal set point for the winter operation. It can go a little bit lower, but not much. And so we lost that in this case in late August, and that's a big difference, right, from normal operations when that's available essentially all year round. Normal operations. And then
Greg, I have a question.
Yeah.
From online. Somebody asked, how many years will we see drawdowns?
Getting there. We are going to be required to do these drawdowns while the injunction is in place. Then there's going to be a transition point where the injunction will be lifted. But what takes the injunction's place will be our requirements under the Endangered Species Act in the form of what's called a biological opinion. That document is a document that's being worked on now by ourselves and, more importantly, the National Marine Fisheries Service, who ultimately is the entity that authors that document. That document will be out sometime after the injunction was planned. The plan for the injunction was to be lifted. That will then end up guiding future operations. Now, in our EIS process, we had identified in our preferred, what we call our preferred alternative, and this is, there's no final decision on this yet. We identified a structure as the long-term plan for fish passage at Lookout. And inherently, what that would mean is the structure would sit out on the reservoir and essentially fluctuate normally with a pool. And so you'd have relatively normal operations. Now, understand that the timeline for implementing that structure is really long. Really long. And so the practical reality is that the drawdown then becomes the tool, the thing that you can do while you're in the implementation phase of that structure. So it's going to be in place more than likely for an extended period of time. And we don't know the exact timeline of that yet. But the reality is it's going to be around.
When you say extended, you mean decades?
Decades.
Or-
Decades.
Okay.
And I believe that answers the follow-up question that this attendee had, is for how many years? So the answer to that question was likely decades.
So just to clarify, we're still working all that.
Maybe to clarify a little bit his question as well, is, so the injunction is the court order that we're under now, that's non-discretionary. And once we receive a biological opinion from NIMS, from the National Marine Fisheries, it becomes discretionary again for us, for our path forward. And we need to undergo, and we have been, the NEPA process for what that environmental, for us to be in environmental compliance with our next steps. And part of that is the Endangered Species Act. And what we've proposed under that so far is to continue drawdowns until we're able to build a structure, which may take us 15 to 20 years to get to building that structure. It's not a trivial, it's like a floating football field barge that has to connect to a new outlet on the dam. So it's a construction process.
Yeah, and understand that this will be identified more than likely in the buyout. It's discretionary, but remember, the reason we're sitting here tonight was that we were found to have violated ESA for not doing things that were identified in the buyout, both either having done them at all or not meeting time limits. So my point is that you're going to be doing those things unless you want to open yourself up to additional litigation. So it's important to do the things that are in the buyout.
Has anybody looked into fish ladders or anything along those lines, or is that prohibited?
I'll talk a little bit about that. The best way to talk about it.
We have a question over here.
That's right, he's probably gonna get to.
Okay, thank you.
I'm also getting some questions rolling in from online to make this a little bit more manageable for those attending online. We're going to have a question period at the end of the presentation, so just hold tight. We'll get to you. Okay.
Yeah, let me walk through just. Wanted to walk through the recreational impact, and then I want to talk about the turbidity, obviously. The turbidity over here to the right, sorry, Jimmy, yeah, just there you go. So on the right here is the turbidity data that was collected at two locations down below Lookout Point Dam. The one location is essentially in the tail race, so right below Lookout itself. And then the second one is the Middle Fork line down at Jasper, so further down. So that's influenced by Fall Creek and a number of other things. But obviously the one in the tail race is influenced by just what we're doing at Lookout. And I think everybody here is tracking that in doing these drawdowns, this river, the reservoir transitions to a river and it recuts the channel. It's the only way it can happen. And so, you know, we've got sediment that's accumulated in Lookout Point's case since 1954. And as you draw that reservoir down, and that reservoir goes from reservoir to river, that river's picking up that sediment that's accumulated and dropping it back out, picking it up and dropping it back out. And that reservoir, and more of it transitions to river, more of that's going on. And some of you, I'm sure, were up there seeing that physically happen. This drawdown is very different than the Fall Creek drawdown. So at the Fall Creek drawdown, where it's all the way to stream bed, you get a lot of gravel, sand, all kinds, and you see a lot of like channel filling. You're not going to see that here. And the reason is because you have the residual reservoir. And so the heavier material, the sands, gravels, those things, they settle back out in that 2-mile residual reservoir that was there. But what we all saw and what we were dealing with down here for months and months was this really fun turbid material, stuff that could stay in suspension is what did stay in suspension. And that's what you saw. That's what you saw here. And I mean, and some of the stuff stayed in suspension all the way to Portland. It remains differently. It's that fun. And so, the turbidity is then a measurement of really at the end of the day, sort of light penetration in water. But the more things that are in suspension, the higher the number ends up being. And that's reflected. And, the background levels of turbidity measurements in our basin are extraordinarily low. In the summertime, it'd be around a half NTU, probably, give or take, depending on the system, maybe a little higher here. In this case, we had Lookout Point was running at times around the 400 or 500 range pretty consistently during this drawdown, and had spikes even above that at times. It's a big impact. It's the bottom line. And the thing that we have seen at Fall Creek, where we've done this for a long time, is that it does get better. It happens later. The magnitude and the duration tend to shrink. So you see less of it, and it tends to be in a smaller window. And the reason, can we walk through this now? Next slide. Let's go to the next one. So what this is just some aerial photos of Lookout on different dates this year. And you can get a sense for just exactly what I was trying to kind of articulate clumsily in words, which is that river having to recut that channel, right? So if you look back in, that August 30 shot, remember where that was? That was basically at our normal set point limit, our minimum conservation pool. That's roughly where we were at that moment. And you can see the reservoir looks essentially normal, right? I mean, you can see a little tinge out there if you look real close. But you can see the normal delta out there too. That's that normal set point in the winter. And that's where a lot of that material has settled out over 60, 70 years, right? You can see it there in that photo, if you look carefully. And then as you started bringing that pool down, look at that September, that part of that what is reservoir in the August 30 shot is now river. And it's a sandbox, right? That river is running through just accumulated sediment. And so initially it's picking that stuff up and down. And eventually what happens is it kind of carves its way through. And the channel kind of widens and it digs it out, and then it's pushing it down. It's pushing it down and putting it back down. And then eventually, you can see again on the 4th, you're drawing down even further. And now we've converted more reservoir to river. And then that final shot on the 29th of October, this is just days before we would have been completely down. At that point, the river cut all that it was going to cut. And then you can see how much of that really fine material is in suspension there. And then you have that turbidity that's in Lookout and Dexter. So one of the things that, and this is a question that we get a lot, is, well, will it get better? Yeah, because eventually this channel starts to clear more and more and more. And maybe it's a little more visual, if you can see it this way. You know, this drawdown being, the duration it is, the channel actually had a significant amount of time to start to clear. And so, for instance, if you look at this October 29th shot, up where the normal head of the reservoir was, that river actually started to clear up even up there, in this operation. And more of that will happen over time. It'll clear that accumulated sediment out. And so you won't see over time as much of this. It'll start later, because the section that tends to clear is the upper section, right? This is the one that's river for the longest period of time. And then hopefully the magnitude also eventually comes down, because you're just not moving. Now, you're gonna get high turbidity. I don't want to send a signal that you're not gonna see high turbidity. You're gonna see it. But I do think when this starts and the magnitude of it over time, it's gonna get less. And we can model that till we're moving the face. We'll get it wrong. Models are always wrong, so we'll only can wait and see how it actually plays out on the ground, even though we might have some.
Obviously, winter storms affect this, but since
Yeah.
you've been doing it longer on Fall Creek, has it been predictable?
Yeah, well, what's happened at Fall Creek is, let me give you an example. One of the first years, we started doing Fall Creek again more recently. It was in 2011, where we started doing full reservoir drawdowns again. Back then, when you drop below the normal set point at Fall Creek at 728, that's its normal set point in the winter, you would start seeing this turbidity completely. And that's because there was still this accumulated sediment, just like what you're seeing here in the channel. But now we bring the pool back up to 700, like 30 feet below the conservation. And unless there's turbidity coming from the river itself way up high, you don't see it, because that channel has cleared all throughout there. You just don't see it anymore. And so we have seen that come down. Now, it still fluctuates annually, because if you have 3 atmospheric rivers,
Right.
and a lot of flow, there's a bigger, wider river, it's cutting more of that. 20, I think it was last year. I went out there at Fall Creek and it was down at 680, so it was all the way down. There was a point where it actually cleared the entire way through. Now, that was because the flow was really low and the channel was confined to a pretty small area, but it was running clear at that point. So that's, I think.
I'm thinking predictability of 20 years while we're waiting for a solution so we can run a water plant, type of thing.
Yeah, well, that's, I think here's the frustrating part. The predictable part is that it's gonna get better each year. The frustrating part with the plants and then is this annual variation I just talked about, which is if you have 3 atmospheric rivers come in, you're gonna get a really high spike. In a year you don't, you may not see nearly as much.
No, but at least that's coming.
Yes.
It's not like you wake up.
Forecast,
Yeah.
in terms of how the operation is shaped
Yeah.
for the year, to say, well, we know it started to show up around this time.
Yeah,
And so you would then have an opportunity to shape your O&M operations around that. Somewhat
That's what-
predictable. Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, and I guess the last point to make on. Yeah, just that trend, that it should get better. We have sent a letter already to the judge, telling the judge that we were going to come up, likely gonna bring a modification for it. What might that look like? Well, I think what we're hoping to do with the drawdown is make it better. And the way that you make this better has to begin with making sure that the fish passage is better. And then what you hope is that also the impacts to all these other things are also better. And it looks to me that that's the case, and the way that we think will ultimately, and we have not done this yet, and we're still working on some modeling, we're still having conversations, with internally. Is likely the drawdown will occur later. And the reason there's several reasons that's beneficial, and I'm not even gonna begin to talk about the temperature aspects of this tonight. But that is a big part of this story on the fish passage side, that's really critical. And it turns out that having a later drawdown would actually help that, we think significantly. The other part of that we think would be good is that will likely allow for reservoir recreation longer. Right, because we'll be up higher in the pool for longer. And then the third aspect of it is we're hoping to do specifically with this turbidity is you're probably not gonna change the magnitude of it. But if you go back to the turbidity graph, this will make a little more sense. Imagine that turbidity coming out in a shorter window. In other words, for the plants, instead of having to deal with it for 4 months, maybe we can narrow that window so that it's in a tighter range, essentially. That's really the hope, and that's good for fish, it's good for people, it's a win-win-win. You know, if we can narrow that window of which we're experiencing some of those higher turbidities. So that's the goal of the modification. Again, we've given that heads up. We're working towards that, and we're hoping to put that in place. Okay.
Do you have a plan for actually being able to grade whether this is really improving the fish passage?
Yeah, perfect segue.
Good one,
The perfect segue. So somebody asked a question about the fish passage piece earlier, and obviously there's tons of interest in whether this actually works. So I think the way to talk about this is to understand that we're going to have to use multiple different monitoring approaches over multiple years to ultimately say that this thing works for fish. And the reason is that each one of the approaches that we take is going to give us some insight to some aspect of this operation. It just sounds like, what's he talking about? Let me give you an example. So the traps. Everybody's seen the little fish traps down below the dams? They're basically a turbine unit without a turbine. They spin with water, right? But they have a vein inside of them in the water. But it's collecting fish that come down through. And what those tell you is what's coming out of their species. It's what are the species coming out. You can get your hands on those fish and you can say, well, they're this size and it's this species and this, 95% of them you're collecting are alive and 5% of them are dead. And maybe that changes as you bring the pool down, or maybe it's better. They give you some real insight into timing, species composition, these kinds of things. What they don't do a very good job of is helping you understand the actual numbers of fish that passed. I mean, think of a tiny fraction. You see that thing, a tiny fraction of water that thing's actually sampling, right? It's just a teeny fraction. And so they have what's called really low fish collection efficiencies. But that's a real limitation because we want to say something about the numbers, but if you're only collecting this really tiny fraction, it makes trying to expand the numbers really tough. So not the best way to measure certain aspects of this project, and yet they're very valuable in one sense. They're giving us data immediately. Did fish pass? Is there some relative survival benefit that we seem to see as the pool came down? Yes. Lots of fish passed during this operation. But then we've got other fish that are tagged with a variety of different tags. And that's going to give us a different picture. That's going to give us more robust survival data. It's going to tell us something about the fish after they leave here too, how they survive. And then each year is going to be a bit different there's gonna be some environmental variability, especially with the natural origin fish or the fish that are actually the target of this whole operation. We have done these operations, well, we did one at Fall Creek in 22, the first year of the injunction, we drew Fall Creek all the way down. That had already been going on, but it was in the injunction. We didn't get any fish passed. Well, that stinks. They died before they ever hit the reservoir. They died as adults when they spawned, before they spawned, and then we had incredibly, if you remember, the summer and fall of 2021. We had the heat dome in June of 2021. It was like 108, 109 degree air temperatures. Well, guess what? When you have that high air temperatures, guess what your water temperatures do? And poor little Fall Creek is not the most robust place. It doesn't have a lot of flow, and it doesn't have very cold flow. And so we lost those fish before they ever showed up in our. And so that's why you do these studies for multiple years, because you've got environmental variability, you've got variability in the methodologies and the tools that you're using to try to. Eventually, you put that whole picture together and say, it worked or it didn't work, but we have some answers now. Did fish move out? Absolutely. I mean, fish, and that was not unexpected. This guy's catching walleye down here or whatever. The walleye weren't sitting down below deck. There was some down below Dexter, but the walleye are a reflection of fish that were moving out of the reservoir. Bass were moving out of the reservoir. In the past, we've known this, and this without the drought. We had millions of crop that would move out of Lookout every year, whether you knew that or not. And the Chinook, we know, will move too. Now, we're going to get the exact numbers on our test fish here in the next few months, and we'll be able to say, hey, 50% of the test fish moved out under the drawdown, or they didn't. We don't know what those numbers are yet, but I think they'll be pretty good. And then we're going to contrast that with our natural origin fish and see how they did. They're in the river and the reservoir for much longer. They got a tougher gut, and they can be influenced by a lot of different things outside the drawdown itself. So that can muddy and cloud the picture as you're trying to put all that together. But we're going to do that. We're going to use multiple methods for multiple years and put all this together. We have just released a monitoring report to the court yesterday. We're required to do these twice a year, and we've been doing that since the injunction's been in place. That's the first place where some of that data is going to be available. I don't know when we're going to publicly post it, but that's the intention, is to publicly post it. And so the information that we do have, we'll pass along, and we'll start trying to paint that picture. Obviously, we have a huge vested interest in whether this works. So the fish, so do all the people. And so it's really critical that we get good, robust answers to this trial. Next.
I'll talk for just a minute, and maybe if there's more questions about what comes after the injunction, we can get into some more of this information in the question and answer period. But this is a single snapshot that came out of I was talking about that environmental compliance process, the NEPA and the ESA, that will be the plan for what we do after the injunction. So this came out of a publicly available document, our draft environmental impact statement that got published last November. And this is the preferred alternative. There were 6 alternatives explored in that environmental impact statement, but this is the preferred alternative that mirrors what we've submitted into the ESA process. And I think importantly at Lookout Point, but again, if there's questions on other reservoirs, at Lookout Point, the long-term preferred alternative is to build that downstream fish passage structure. So that's to get little fish coming downstream to get through the dam, instead of doing a drawdown or spill operation, a big floating barge that collects the fish, and then we transport the fish around the dam. But you can see the timeline is on the top there, that it would be, this is showing that would be finished construction in 2044. So the plan would be to continue doing the drawdown until that passage is an option for fish. And then I think there was a question about fish ladder. So at a lot of Willamette dams, so there's downstream fish passage to get the little fish going down the dam to go out and grow in the ocean, and then you get the adult fish that come back and want to go back up above the dam to spawn. And so it's that adult fish passage back going above the dam is where a fish ladder, or in most Willamette dams, we have adult fish facilities, where it's a really short fish ladder where we catch them in tanks, and then we put them in trucks and truck them around the dam, versus the fish ladder that goes all the way up and over the dam. But that type of fish ladder is that where you have like a continuous water ladder that goes all the way above the dam, and maybe you could use it for downstream passage, is better for shorter dams. So the taller the dam is, the longer that ladder would have to be. And like a Lookout Point dam, it had to be a prohibitively long ladder. So really we have these trucking operations that we've set up for adult fish, and you have to have the downstream collector for the little fish, which is the part we don't have, and was a key thing that we didn't build that lost the lawsuit. So if there's questions about Detroit or Hills Creek or any of the other locations, like what the plan is, we can definitely take questions on that. And this is all, like I said, this is a snapshot. We'll know more about what the future holds once we get that biological opinion. It's all kind of being worked out between the federal agencies for what our actual plan is. And we should know that sometime this fall, but definitely by December of 2024.
So in terms of actual construction activity right now, I think many of you probably know we're starting the Dexter adult fish collection facility, the reconstruction of that. And so it's hard to see up there, but those blue lines represent construction. And so that is underway right now, will be going on for the next couple of years. So probably the most visible construction thing you can see your logo.
Tell me about this barge thing. Is it below the dam, above the dam?
It's in the forebay of the reservoir.
So
So
above the dam,
Above the dam.
right at the dam on the upstream side.
So Lookout had one of those. 1954, there was a collector that was put in the forebay of the reservoir. Didn't work very effectively. It wasn't very big. It was much smaller scale than what's being planned now. But we did have one that was sort of Lookout. And then the whole volitional. So some of you have in your head these fish ladders, like you've seen on the Columbia River. Maybe these fish are just happily swimming their way up the ladder, and away they go. The Willamette dams, because of, like Kelly mentioned, the height, but also this kind of the real key part of it is it's the backside. It's the fluctuation that you for flood control. The Columbia River dams don't operate that way. They don't operate for flood control. Whatever comes in, comes out. So they basically have static reservoir elevations, which allows for these volitional ladders. We just don't have that. The Willamette project would have built volitional ladders if it were technically possible, because we were already building them on the Columbia, or had already built them on the Columbia. But it's just not technically possible, and so we're in this trap and haul business for the rest of our existence.
How long have they been taking the salmon, the adults, up above Lookout Point?
Yeah. So in 1954, dam got constructed. We mitigated for the entire block area of the dam. So what I mean by that is there was really never any intention to maintain a population of fish above that dam. However, there was an intention to maintain them below the dam. And so where this all went wrong is people didn't understand the importance of temperature in that process. And it turns out Dexter Dam is essentially was the point at which spring Chinook salmon spawned and above. So you kind of locked them in to the area below the dam they historically never used. It had altered water temperatures and you couldn't support spawning down, even though that was the intention. Now you see a lot of fish spawning down there, but they're not successful. They haven't been. So in the mid-90s, a number of entities really wanted to start to explore the idea of re-establishing some of these fish populations above the dam. And then the key thing that happened was that the fish were listed under the Endangered Species Act of 1991. The only way you're going to improve the status of these fish in some of these basins is to put them back in the historic habitat, especially here when it's outside the historic spawning habitat and it's modified thermally by temperature. The only way you're going to improve the numbers is to put them back up there. So that started happening in the mid-90s. The adults are going up, but there wasn't a lot of focus on the downstream aspects of that. We were just kind of letting whatever happened. And what happened was not much. Didn't get very many adults back from that. You need to have all aspects of this kind of in place, right? You have to get the juveniles through safely downstream to get back to adults. And so that's really what these injunction operations and what the long-term downstream fish passage operations will focus on is improving. They're about the
I think there might have been a few more slides, but I think we've covered the content. If there's, if there's online questions.
Yeah.
Rick, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Thank you, appreciate it. So I'm curious the way that, I hear you saying, just trying to think about this a little bit, getting to the, predictability of the water treatment plant.
Yeah.
I hear it's drawdown until we get to the platform. And that platform is decades out. Is there a way that we can do a smaller platform sooner? And only moderate a little bit of the drawdown to get to the point of shorter window, less turbidity. So instead of one or the other, we do a little bit of each and try to do a little bit sooner and try to mitigate this. So we're not decades out, maybe we're only a decade out, but it's a little bit easier, a little bit faster.
Yeah. So I hit on this a bit, but what are the tools in the tool belt here to make this better? And then again, it has to start with the fish passage aspects, and that's exactly what we're intending to do. So what we're going to do is, because everything we're doing now is operational, is to try to modify the operational aspect itself. And again, I kind of touched on how you do that. You simply shift this thing to the right a little bit, so if it happened later, the drawdown would be a little more aggressive, and that would bin everything into a tighter window. So that's what we're that's the realistic thing. And that's assuming that the plaintiffs and the judge sign off. Okay. The structures are difficult because they're very, very costly. And even with some of that cost, there's a lot of variability in how well they actually perform. So we built something like what you just were kind of describing, which was called the portable floating fish collector over at Cooper Dam. Mm-hmm. It was a mini version of these things that are contemplated as the long-term solution. What we saw with that, it was tested like crazy and extensively, is it just doesn't collect effectively enough of the fish to really meaningfully move the needle. Until you scale these things up to a much larger scale, you're just not collecting enough of the fish. So I'm a little bit pessimistic about the idea of, I mean, your idea is a great idea to take this kind of multi-pronged approach and try to speed it up. I'm a bit pessimistic about it just because of my experience with those smaller structures and the one that they're costly and generally just have not worked. I mean, again, we had a structure like that in Lookout in the fifties that they tested, it was too small scale, didn't work, even some of the big ones. So if you go around the Pacific Northwest, and I hate to think this picture, but if you go around the Pacific Northwest, and look at it around you. You know, the Lewis River system, some of these, they have not performed very, very well across the board. There are some you can point to and go, wow, okay, really well. So quite a bit of variability in how those structures perform, and that makes doing some sort of hybrid approach pretty difficult. We're still putting the picture together on how many fish are we getting out in the spring. That's new. That's something new too. And we're doing it more than we ever have in the past. We got this drawdown in place, you know, again, we try to minimize its effects, its impact, and it really will get better, both in terms of the amounts of setting and stuff. And again, and we modify the operation itself. And then, you know, we'll see, you know, where we end up. It's a very difficult bar and hurdle that we're trying to get over. On the fish abundance side, it's a big lift. And so I don't want to give people false hope. I don't do that. About, oh, yeah, just put this whole thing in, that'll do it. Nothing in my 25 years of doing this tells me that would work. I wish it did. I wish it would, because that would make all this a lot easier. And we're in the business of, you know, we want to do our very best to impact anybody. We want people to have benefit associated with that.
Thank you. I'm not sure if it's fine or not. I've got a very expensive problem. I live right across Highway 58 from Lookout Point. I can see the boat ramp on the other side of the signal point. When the reservoir gets at the bottom of the boat ramp and any lower, my well will dry. I got a 250-foot well, which has been perfectly fine for 40 years until this has happened. Every time I call Army Corps of Engineer guy that's got all this education, they said, well, we did not foresee any wells going dry. I didn't see my well going dry either, but it cost me $28,000. We went 13 weeks without water. Every 8 days, Max knows, I was packing water. $28,000 for somebody just living along the lake is an awful big chunk. I just, I'm a good person, I'm easygoing, but it can make you kind of ornery.
Yeah.
When people treat you like that.
I understand.
And this is the first time 730, so it went down to 730 feet in elevation. When it went lower than that, my well went dry. Like I said, it's been up there for 40 years and never had any problems. I have a bill here. And I want you guys to look at it. Okay. I don't think I should have to. I got 2 wells now. What do I want 2 wells for? No, I got 7 grandkids. One of them's in college. I got better places to earn my money to go than here. For another well that I didn't even want. But you know, the value of my house would be worth, I went 13 weeks without water. The value of my house would be worth nothing. If I told the buyer, oh, this is a great space, but you're gonna have to go 13 weeks without water. You know, what the heck? No big deal. Give me your 500,000. So.
And I'm sorry.
I've heard that. I've heard so much.
You and I are the ones that talk about the phone, actually.
I know. I've heard so much. Oh, I'm so sorry. Too bad, so sad. I don't pay this bill. Take a good look at it. All you can look at it. But that's what it cost me. There was 3 other wells that went dry. I don't know why they're not here, but I am. I went to the Sweet Home meeting for Foster Lake,
Mhm.
there's 500 people in that room. Evidently, the people in Lowell are satisfied with the way things are going. I know Max, I'm really happy that you got your money for your treatment plant. Because Lowell is a pretty cool place to live. I would be horrified to think that the reason it didn't grow was because, well, affordable housing for one thing, and bad water. Keep that water cleaned up and people will move here. All right,
Appreciate
kind of out of my comfort zone.
No, it's important for us to hear all these things, and we are obviously capturing every one of these things and trying to document all this stuff for people, and it's. I mean, I'll just say it on a personal level. I'm not doing this job to impact people. It's not why any of us get in the business. We don't want that. We've been operating these dams for societal benefit, right, for 70 years. That's what we always want to do. And, you know, this is just one of those very, very difficult situations where we're complying with the law. And in doing that, it has some tremendous impact, you know.
I would venture that the Eagles aren't doing all that well either, when they get real muddy, they can't see any fish to grab out of the water.
No, they disappeared for a while. They're back,
Pretty skinny.
there's five eagle out there right now.
I mean, I'll say this about. Many other presentations, but one of the presentations we do, I mean. I think sometimes people think there are these silver bullet operations out there, that if we just do this, then it's all gonna be positive, it's all gonna be good. It's all gonna be, that is not true. There's not one of those out there. And that's true when it comes to our authorized purposes. You know, there's, this is an example of an impact associated with it. Lack of recreation, site turbidity, all that stuff, you know, so we impact our authorized purposes, but even on the fish side, there are things that between different listed species, some of them benefit, some of them get impacted. Even within a species, what we do for an adult is bad for a juvenile, you know, and so this drawdown is that too. It's got pros for certain things, and it's got some huge cons associated with it, and that's just the reality of it. Difficult.
Yeah, question. Go ahead.
Yes, well, that's what I want to tag on to the no silver bullet, and that to me is what this barge solution represents. That's unknown, unproven, and not permitted. I mean, I was reading up on this, there's a lot of people that aren't necessarily in favor of that. It's not like you can proceed with that today and go through the permitting process because it's been approved. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, these are decisions that are now being mapped out for the future, and it's one of several
Yeah.
structural measures, so
Yeah.
it require a vote.
So that's why I want to get back to the, you know, other than what it's gonna take to minimize, because at what point does the operational become the solution? Because it's gonna take 40 years to get a capital solution that isn't gonna be a silver bullet.
Right.
So that's why I'm saying, then you can handle these operational things that happen, like with water treatment plants in the communities that are operating, you know, near the dams, and people that happen to have wells and stuff. My gosh, just the engineering over the next couple of years to try and develop the solution to even get somebody to look at it would pay for all of these improvements, given that you guys are working on predictability and that just as the drawdowns happen, that it gets better. You know, when the biological opinion is gonna come out, but that's not gonna be it either. I mean, it sounds like we're gonna take another 10 years to try and map out the capital solution, or at least try and plan the plan for it. When we could have spent that money over the next 10 years to try and make communities whole with the operational stuff at the dams.
I think-
Am I making any sense?
No, you are. I think what's difficult is that
Or can we do both?
there's an implementation timeline associated with our overall compliance with endangered species. And so if you take a step back, we didn't talk about this so much, but if you take a step back, you know, I mean, the federal government over the next 30 years is going to invest $1 to $2 billion to try to improve the status of these fish populations based on this implementation timeline. Not every one of those things can happen all at once, because we're going to get these chunks of money over this 30-year period, essentially. And it's still going to be really significant money, right? I mean, you kind of annualize that, it's $100 million or better, but they're happening staggered. They're not happening on top of each other, and it makes it slow, you know, it makes it slow. And, you know, the place like Lookout got pushed later in part because of some other uncertainties around it versus a place like Cougars a little bit earlier in that process. And so the stuff is staggered, and the timelines are very, very slow.
The other answer to your question now, and I know you know this, is we have to work within the authorities and the appropriations that we're given. You know, and I think specific to the issue of wells, we looked really hard to see where we would have any kind of authority to try to provide relief. We just didn't find one. So the question of, you know, what can be done is we have to work within the authorities, and then dollars that come with that authorization from Congress that we have. This is what we have today. I don't have the answers to what that might look like in the future, but. You know,
And I guess it just had, would that be in the biological opinion that says that we're gonna need to continue the drawdowns as the operational thing until a future solution? Is that how the process works? That could be incorporated into the operational things that we have to do?
Sure. So maybe two answers to, and you tell me if I'm getting closer to what you're looking for, but there's 13 Willamette Valley dams that New States operates. And we looked at what the long-term downstream fish passage option, you know, where there's salmon. We looked at downstream fish passage options, and some of those places like Green Peter, the long-term downstream fish passage option that we think it will be effective long-term is going to be continuing to do the operation. So you know, in our preferred alternative, we're not planning to build this, you know, fish barge. It'll just be continuing to do the operation, and that's because of the way that dam's configured, that we think it'll be effective for high fish survival, you know, in the long term. At Lookout Point, the way it's designed, our models don't think it's going to be a high enough amount of fish survival. It's good, it's better than what we have been doing, but it's not good enough for like the standards that are out there.
Okay, so that's not an option.
So we don't think that'll be a long-term option. Maybe there's some other option that doesn't exist yet, that, you know, in 10 years from now, NOAA will help us determine. But right now, the options that we had on the table, we're continuing to do the operation. We don't think it'll be as good as what we think a fish barge would be. And I'm calling it fish barge, but that's not what we're calling it. A floating screen.
Vacuum on a barge.
Yeah.
And some people want this, and parts of the country they've done it already. Remove the dams, go back to the historic stream, you know, runs. That's a nightmare scenario, I think, for anybody, but there are activists who are open, you know, suggesting that, and all we need is one activist judge. Do you think there's any danger of that?
So one of the things that's different about these dams versus dams in other places, let's say the Klamath, the Snake, is the flood control mission that these dams perform. And the annual benefit of that, like when Congress thinks about what projects they want to continue supporting, or maybe what projects they don't want to continue supporting, they think about it and what's the dollar amount taxpayers receive as benefit. And the amount of flood control benefit that Oregon and the federal government receives is billions of dollars a year from our flood control operations. So it's, you know, maybe maybe there's a dam or two in the system, I don't know, but like the Willamette Valley Flood Control Mission as a whole is immensely beneficial to in that calculation that the government goes through.
And go back to something Greg said earlier about silver bullets, I mean, that's just one of the consequences, that there are issues around water quality and temperature and other things that would have to be considered for that to be managed. So it's not something that's being discussed, but I know that was kind of a question that was out in the public eye as other dams were being removed and you saw these dams coming down in different ways. I think we've been pretty clear and direct that that's not the case here, but I know that it still persists in some conversations, so.
Yeah, another, I think give you one other piece on that. I would encourage you to go back and look at actual dam removals in Oregon, Washington, Pacific Northwest. I think what you're gonna find is they follow a very specific playbook. That playbook is a private entity trying to get a FERC license. They go get the FERC license, now they need to meet the Endangered Species Act requirements. Those are costly. And it turns out that all these removals are an economic decision that a private company makes. Yeah. It doesn't matter which one you choose, Elwha, White Sand, Barnett, all of them. Every single one of them has been that exact playbook, and it's not close, and it's not the same situation at all. And so I think that's kind of important context. Nobody's that I know that actually knows anything about this is talking about it.
I'm sure there's a very obvious reason why this is a dumb question, but I don't know it. You talked about the high mortality rate of the turbines. Is there any ability to make changes to that system?
No, I was gonna say, Greg, explain that a little bit better, what goes on with those turbines and why the fish don't live through them.
Yeah. So I guess I'll just contrast the two that we have, where one works better than the other. These fish can die for several reasons in any passage route. One of the ways they die, and it's pretty easy to think about, is as they're coming down through some route, they hit something. Well, at Dexter, we have, this is a fish biologist, not a turbine guy.
Engineering guys are.
It's an oversized boat motor.
Yeah, that's exactly.
It's a prop. It's a prop, but it's a slow prop, and it's a big prop. Okay. Versus up here at Lookout, it's not a prop. It's got a ton of kind of vertical blades almost on it. And they're a lot closer together and they're spinning a lot faster. So it turns out, it's not a horrible explanation, but that fish physically strike and die more often in one of those scenarios versus the other. So in Dexter, we have that scenario. The other way that this happens is these fish often, and you guys, probably a lot of people saw the pictures at Green Peter of all the dead kokanee.
Oh, yeah.
What happened then? So what happened there is these fish, when they go under any kind of gate structure, they experience a pressure change. And so the thing that can make that pressure change, the experience that they have really change, is how much is the gate open? How much water, or what we call head, is over that gate? Like, it turns out the more that you have over it, kind of the faster and the more that pressure change they experience. And it really impacts them. So these fish that died at Green Peter that were so visual, the reason they were visual is because they experienced barrel trauma. They got the bends. So this would be akin to you being down really deep in the ocean and immediately coming to the surface.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happened to them. They couldn't regulate their swim bladders. They puffed up, and that's why they're all floating on the surface, and most of them are dead. So that's the kinds of things that can happen. So when we're designing these operations, the trick is, and this is part of why the drawdown works, is you reduce that head. And then the gate opening itself ends up being larger for a same volume flow to get that amount of flow out. So you have a bigger gate opening. These fish experience less pressure change. And you can see this improvement in the survival as the pools come down. in part for that reason. And then the physical striking of there's other things that happen, but those are the kind of two things. It's the design of that particular turbine.
My controversial question I was trying to get at is
Change it.
remove them.
Yes.
Because that entryway is so much higher, but you just explain why that would work.
Well,
because it's such a
no,
dramatic-
no, that's a very logical follow on, which is, well, why don't you just take one of the turbines out? You could do that. The problem you run into with then having that conduit and then water flowing through that conduit is you still have to manage that water. And it turns out that if you just took the turbine, one thing that the turbine does really well, right, is it dissipates a bunch of that energy. That's how we get the energy. And so you still have to manage that energy some way, somehow. And so what that requires, it's not as simple as take the turbine out of the conduit and let them go. I mean, it seems like it.
You still have to lower it to be near the surface,
You'd
so
have to
less
do
pressure,
some-
right?
You'd have to do something. Or you'd have to structurally modify that in some way that I don't know anything about, but you'd have to come up with a way to dissipate and manage that energy that then was fish friendly. So it would still require a structural solution, is sort of the bottom line. It's not a bad thought. And there's a study that the Corps is going through to look at hydropower now across the board. And some folks that are proponents of that study have that same thought. It may or may not be reality, but it's something that's being. It's a good thought. It's a good question.
For the folks online, if you have any questions, press the raise hand button.
Are there any other questions in the chat?
That's what he's trying to find.
It's okay, participants. Alicia, if you want to turn your sound on, you're free to jump in here.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So my questions that I've typed here are: at the end of last year, there were letters sent asking the federal judge to modify the drawdown order. And I'm curious if there's been any updates, not so much what the Army Corps has sent, but I know that there were numerous politicians in the state of Oregon and other water, groups that sent letters. Do you have any updates on that?
And I don't think we do have any feedback on what was done with those letters or how they were considered. I think, not to confuse that what Greg's referring to is working back through the Department of Justice to the court to say, here are some things we're considering to improve these operations, which is the framework we have to work in now. But I have not heard any feedback. I don't know that we have heard any feedback from what was sent from state, county, local folks.
We have Charlie Conrad, our local representative for the House, here with us tonight. Charlie?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Appreciate it. So Charlie Conrad, state rep, one of the folks that helped write those letters. Signed on the letters, I think we might have Rep. Jamie Kate. She was gonna watch virtually if she could as well, who represents up in the Green Peter area. Also on those letters, we have not heard back. We know that Governor Kotek also has worked to try and get something to happen. I have not heard back from the judge with what we can do to help modify this. We had a number of our federal delegations sign on. Sir, I think if you're the one that contacted my office, Val Hoyle and her staff were also trying to look for some of the appropriations on the federal side, to figure out, okay, what can we actually do to give the Corps those right appropriations so that we can go and take care of it. We're trying currently in the short session now to help see if we can take care of some of these impacts, both to individuals and the cities. So it is all in flux. We don't have any solutions right now, and hopefully we will at some point in time, but we're still working it. We're still working at this point in time, so I don't have a definitive answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm curious if there's any timeline for that possible update.
No.
Okay, and then where would we find the information when that, unforeseen update does happen?
If we any information that we get, one way or the other, regardless of what that's gonna be, we're gonna publicize it. It'll be in the paper, we'll be doing outreach, we'll be connecting with the cities, connecting with the community, connecting with the core. All those interested parties, we will be putting it out there and making it as obvious and as transparent as we can. And particularly if it's something positive, we can actually take action, where we can actually help the cities and the communities, where we can actually help individuals who have been impacted by it. Then absolutely, we're gonna have direct outreach to them and be able to connect them with whatever resources and processes need to be developed. So that they can actually get whatever appropriations, whether funds are coming their way. So it'll be obvious, and we'll do it as soon as we possibly can, as soon as we have an answer one way or the other.
Thank you. Yes.
Any other online questions?
I guess I do have an unrelated question regarding erosion of the land. You know, anytime we draw down water, obviously erosion becomes a concern. So I'm just curious what has been kind of considered on that level.
Hey, Alicia, are you talking in the reservoir or downstream of the dam? Or both?
Both, anywhere and everywhere that water would flow.
Yeah. So, I mean, in the reservoir, the river will continue to cut a channel as we draw it down. And like we saw this year, you know, I think it's gonna continue to move around. It generally gets wider over time as it kind of just braids through the reservoir sediments. Downstream of the dam, it's a very different drawdown again than say at Fall Creek, where you have actual sediment, sand, gravels, all those kinds of things. I think if you go down there and look around, you'll be hard pressed to find sediment, and that's because the stuff is so fine, the stuff that came out, because it had to float through Lookout, it had to float through Dexter, and then that's ultimately what. So that's a long way of saying I don't expect any changes in the areas downstream of the dam in terms of erosion versus just the normal processes that are already down there. I mean, the dams themselves have dramatically reduced erosion in the Willamette Basin, period. And all the revetments and training structures that are in our system. Our river is way more coarse. In other words, the sediments that are down there, go try to find sand down below Dexter Dam. Versus other unregulated rivers that have sand all over the place, you won't find it. And that's because our rivers are very coarse, because the material that can move does move out, and then nothing comes in behind it in places. So I don't see any scenario where you're going to get big changes in erosion versus just the processes that are already in place. It's associated with these drawbacks.
Does the Fall Creek? Oh, go ahead.
What are we gonna do about all the sediment that's coming into our lake? It's not really gonna go down past Dexter Dam unless we allow it to somehow. It's going to accumulate somewhere.
Yeah, so the sediment, I mean, obviously when they put the dams in, they do, right, that there was gonna be some level of this material. It's gonna come in, you know. I know it feels like a lot of material, and there has been a lot of material that's accumulated at the heads of these reservoirs. You saw those pictures. The reality is our systems, in comparison to other parts of the country and other parts of the world, are actually really sediment poor. We're not the Midwest, right? We're not, you know, these reservoirs that have incredible rates of sedimentation and siltation. So we just don't see the amount of deposition into these places. We've monitored it in a number of locations around the Willamette, and the Rogue. And if you look at the amount of filling that's occurred, in other words, storage we've lost because materials, it's pretty small. It's a really small percentage of our overall stored water, as it turns out. That's not because of any great thing we're doing. It's not because it's being more lucky than good. We just happen to have really low overall sediment rates in our systems. So it's not a huge driver, and it certainly hasn't meaningfully impacted our flood damage reduction.
It's a really good question. I mean, it is something that we're monitoring as part of our dam safety and flood risk management commission.
Well, that's really as far as I'm concerned, you're shoving sediment downstream, it's gonna work where it can.
Mayor, at this point, I'd like to turn, I think that's a good segue to our Public Works Department. They're here to talk about the effect on our water treatment operations. Before we turn to them, I want to clarify, there was a special meeting prior to this for approval of capital improvement to the water treatment plant. That was not related to improving our production capacity in response to the turbidity. That was for a separate part of the water treatment plant that had failed, that needs to get replaced. But we can talk about what projects we're looking at in the future to respond to the increased turbidity and make sure we keep up with production. So with that, I'll turn it over to our Public Works Director and City Engineer. Why don't the two of you just give an overview of how the dam drawdown has affected our operations, what we're doing to keep drinking water safe, and then we can touch on our plans for addressing those issues in the future.
All right, well, the basics of the water treatment plant is the first step is getting rid of the sediment in the water. It generally happens by sedimentation in a basin. It gets enhanced by adding a coagulant, which kind of binds the sediment together. Generally, the water treatment plant works when it's less than, I think, 3 NTU. So as we were looking at those NTU graphs, we saw spikes up into the 2000, right below the dam. So as that happens, the treatment plant can still make water, but it has to go much slower because you have to give that sediment time to drop out. You also have to use more chemicals to get that coagulation to happen. So the effect on the treatment plant is that it has to run a lot slower. The treatment plant is currently, kind of undersized to be able to treat enough water running that slow to serve the city. And so we're looking at options to provide additional sedimentation volume at the treatment plant to be able to run water through it faster. So you'd have a kind of a net velocity through that sediment basin. That if we can make the basin bigger, the velocity is smaller, so you can pull more water through. And that's what we're looking at doing in terms of addressing higher turbidity, is by providing more sediment basin volume. Right? Yep. So we're working with the city. City has a application we're working on. Can I talk about
Absolutely.
The Department of Agriculture, USDA, has an emergency application the city's working on that will help fund a lot of this additional sediment basin construction. So right now we're just starting on that application procedure. Been working with the Corps because the treatment plant itself is on Corps property. It's a lease that the city has. But any additional ground disturbance that happens based on constructing a new sediment basin has to go through the Corps procedures and reviews and archaeological approvals to do additional work on the site, so we've just started working with them and working on that application. The application itself is due within 1 year from the initial emergency, which I think was defined as June of last year. When that drawdown, I think when the drawdown started, was that right?
That's when it started.
Yeah, so that's what they've defined as the start of the emergency. So 1 year within that, from that date is when this application's due. So we're certainly gonna be able to get the application in. They will fund up to $1 million of improvements, which we've kind of identified as what it's gonna take to build this advanced sedimentation basin. So that's what we're kind of working on to solve the problem on the city side.
Max, could you describe how your crew responded, how you and your crew responded to the increased turbidity, and especially focus on some of the new processes that we implemented and touch on the state's regulated levels for chlorine and the like?
Okay, so I'll go back a little bit and bring it down a little bit from what Matt was saying and explain a little bit better. So typically, like Matt stated, we're usually around a 3 NTU. That's pretty low.
What is it NTU?
That's the measurement, like you said, of the cloudiness of the water is how it's defined. So the way that it penetrates, and it's really how good you can see through it. So compare a glass of water to a glass of milk, right? So we're normally at the glass of water that you guys have 99% of the time. We were at the glass of milk. Okay, so we need to use a chemical process to be able to remove that. We are pretty fortunate here that their turbidity is pretty low year round. I've been here 10 years, seen a couple spikes around the 10s after a really heavy rain event during their normal flood control operations when the level is at its lowest and it rains hard, so the bank comes down. But that's 1, 2, 3 days, right? In that case, we just turn the plant off, let it pass, we turn it back on. This situation was a little bit different. We knew it was coming. We had communicated, he'd done a presentation. I don't think anybody knew to what extent. Obviously, I think everybody was taken by surprise. So we went from about a 10 to a 50, which is very difficult to treat. The 50 to 300. We stayed in the 300s for a while, and then we peaked up in the thousands. We do samples throughout the day, entirely every day. So just to give you a range where we're at, which is way higher than we ever do. What we ended up doing was, we're pretty lucky at the water plant here. We feed 1 chemical. Besides chlorine, we're required to feed chlorine by state levels for disinfection. We feed 1 coagulant that works pretty well at the plant year round. So we actually ended up feeding a couple more additional chemicals to try to help with the rapid settling of that. Most of you that live here in town know that we had a chlorine smell in the water. That's because we were feeding it after treatment and before treatment. The level was still the same. We still targeted a 0.8 to a 0.9. And the state size were required to be above a 0.2 at all times and below a 4. So we still had a lot of permit to go, but at a certain trigger level on chlorine is when you can smell it. You can't taste it, but you can definitely smell it. So the chlorine was there just to make sure it was safe. We did do additional testing the entire month of October and November to not only satisfy the state's requirement, but to prove to myself and my staff in the city that the water was still safe to drink. I live here as well, so I also drink cold water. It was difficult. We spent many hours down there doing jar tests. So we try to replicate in a little glass jar what happens in the plant before treatment. But what ended up happening, like Matt said, is we typically run about 145 gallons a minute. It's not a very big plant at all. We slowed it down to 100 gallons a minute, so reduced the flow significantly and increased the chemicals significantly. None of the chemicals stay through the process, and they all get filtered out by the sand filter. But one of the side effects that some of you that I see in this room noticed is color. And a water treatment plant does not remove color. Color is the most difficult part to remove. It is not harmful at all, but it does not look nice, obviously. We did have, for about a pretty good week-long period there, we had a tint to the water. It's very fine, and the only way you could have seen it is just filled up your white tub, right? In full volume. You couldn't see it in a glass of water. It doesn't show up on any tests that we run at the plant or that the state runs or that our private lab runs. So that was one of the difficulties that we had. We currently are still feeding those chemicals. We tried to remove them today. We are back up to the 145 because the NTUs are right about a 4.5, which is very manageable for us. However, there's some residual organics left in there that have probably been in the bottom of the lake for 70 years. So we tried to remove the added chemical that we added back in October, and we could not get flock today. When you don't have flock, which is the development of the bunches of tiny particles into one big one so that we can settle it out. When you don't make flock, you can't make water that meets drinking water standards. So to give you guys an idea, we are allowed to put out 0.3 NTU 95% of the time. 0.3 is very, very pristine water, just to regular people. We consistently put out 0.02, which is the lowest level that any equipment will detect. So we make very good water majority of the time. We make good water through the event. Like I said, we did have color and stuff like that, but we used all of our permit. So we can be up to a 0.3. We were right there many times. So go ahead, Bob.
I just want to make a statement. I think at no time did you guys produce any unsafe water. It was safe all the way through from what I could determine.
That is correct.
I still drink water on the tap.
Yeah, we met drinking water standards the entire time. We monitored that to make sure. We did shut the plant off several times. We troubleshoot with both Matt and his staff. He is a water operations specialist. We did communicate with other, municipalities. I was in contact with Sweet Home. I'm a former Sweet Home employee, so I'm very familiar with the process there. So we used all of our tools at disposal. We couldn't get the chemicals that we needed here, so we drove to eWeb and took chemicals from them. They were more than willing to donate them just to get us by until our delivery showed up 3 days later. So, Jimmy?
Max, for everyone's benefit, can you talk about how many hours of labor this took versus normal?
Yeah, so typical day-to-day operations, only 3 of us, myself and 2 other guys that take care of everything in the city, water, sewer, streets, parks, standard. Most typical days, the water treatment plant operation, and not just required, not just lab, not just rounds, making chemicals. That includes O&M, so we have lots of moving parts, pumps, stuff that needs to be calibrated every day. It's a pretty good solid 4 hours, right? Every day, 4 hours, one person dedicated to it. That's not doing jar tests, that's not doing chemical changes, anything like that. The 2nd to 4th week in October, we averaged about 12-hour shifts. We ended up doing split shifts. We didn't have a choice because somebody had to be there to man the plant the entire time. And what it was is the one picture that you had up there of the, the August, September, October, we seen it coming. I went up to the reservoir every day. We were in close contact with DEQ because this was a very untypical year. We had an algae bloom very late into the year, as everybody remembers, the blue-green algae bloom that didn't really go away. So we were doing some sampling for DEQ to test that just for informational purposes. So we made a habit of driving up there each day. And the one picture that he had at the end of September where you could see the clouds starting right at the, the start of the river, so to speak, well, actually to the end of it, but where the lake was, we slowly seen that each day progressing down to lookout. And we knew when it hit to lookout that we were going to go from those 10 to 30s up to the 5, 6, whatever it was going to be. So we stayed on top of it. We knew it was coming. We just didn't know what we were getting ourselves into. So about 12 hours, Jimmy, to answer your question. We did not have the option to turn off the treatment facility for an extended period of time. And the reason being is exactly what Matt said. We have a demand on average in the winter time about 60 gallons per minute to serve the city, everything in the city, schools, everything, stores, the local, the market. So about 60 gallons a minute. So what we like to do is we like to make production at 145, get it to our target level, turn it off, go home, come back the next day, do it all over again. When you reduce that down to 100, you're meeting that demand, but you're not counting for backwashes. So when we do a backwash, we make the water clean through the filter, we stop it, and we take the water we just made and wash it backwards. So all the sediment that we didn't capture in the said basin, we put into a tank for removal later on. So we backwash at 10,000 gallons, right? So a long time running the filter to recoup the water you just used to clean it. So what you do is you're running at that rate, but you're really running the line. We operate the reservoirs full at all times. That's for fire protection and for unforeseen issues. Most of you were here during the special council. The part that they approved tonight was the actual brains and operation of the plant, the electronic part that we can't do what they do. That SCADA and the PLC, that is why we run it full, because it has failed 3 times on us since I've been working here. And when it fails, if the plant is on, you can't turn the plant off. If the plant is off, you can't turn the plant on. So we stay 85% full the entire time of the year. We can't do that in the summertime because we don't have enough capacity. So we had that buffer to be able to use for the first 3-4 weeks of operations. But I will tell you guys, we operated at the lowest levels ever since I've been here. Very low, 10, 12, 14 feet, which is still 50% capacity, and we're talking 1 million gallons, but it makes you nervous a little bit, because if we couldn't make water, then we'd have to truck water in or do some other procedures I hope we never have to do. So I don't want to give too much information, so I really want questions. If there's specific questions, my goal here is to make sure, and my staff's goal and city staff is to make sure the water that comes out of your tap is safe to drink at any time. And as most of you live here know, we had 3 boil water notices unrelated to this issue, 3 boil water notices in 2022 and the beginning of 2023. I've never been part of a boil water notice since I worked here prior to that or at my previous position. So if there's any chance that water might not be safe to drink, we go ahead, and that's turned into the state. So that's not just something that Jeremy puts out, or we call you guys or put on that thing that goes on the local news. It goes on the state page and everything. The biggest thing I want to stress out of this is we always make sure the water is safe for you guys, and if there's a chance, we will let you know immediately if there's not. So same for wastewater. We want to put the best water we can out because we care about the fish and the environment and recreation also. So yeah, you had a question?
I just do, Lowell have any wells?
I figured that question was going to come up. So
We had some.
we do. So we have 3 wells that the city owns currently. One of them in Army Corps Orchard Park, which is the park just to the east of the water plant. You can see on those diagrams. One at the water treatment facility, and then one directly to the west of it, right by the boat ramp there. The city was currently using the wells until the EPA changed the limitations for a very specific metal that everybody knows about, which is arsenic. They cut that in half significantly. So I'm just going to throw a number, but say the limit used to be 20, right? They cut it down to 2. Well, arsenic is naturally occurring in the environment. It's in the soil, right? Everybody that has a well and probably you live at, it's different when we sell it to the public, right? We have to meet different restrictions and they do tests and everything. So the wells that we have do not meet the current EPA standard. That doesn't mean we couldn't use them in emergency or do like a blend. And we've talked about that. That's one of the things we looked at during the master plan, or to put an arsenic treatment on our wells. Our wells are very small. One's 15 gallons a minute, one's 30, and one's 25. In the summertime, we need about 250 gallons a minute. So, an arsenic treatment is very expensive, very, very expensive, and it's very dangerous for the staff because it's done with acid. So we would add a whole new level of safety, and not to mention the cost to run a traditional plant that we have now. It would be at least 1.5 times that to produce less water. So, yeah. But yes, we have the wells for backup. We have looked at that option. We looked at it during the 3-year planning period for the master plan because technology has come a long way since they changed the MCL, which is the maximum contaminant level you can have in the drinking water. So they will always be dedicated backups, for fire protection, for other things. But just not for drinking water at this time. So,
Got a question over here?
The close proximity of the wells to the reservoir, would there be any issues with increased turbidity in wells, due to groundwater influence and exchange of water with the reservoir?
There was, as I stated, we do not run the reservoirs, the wells, we do not use them, we do not turn them on. Every once in a while we turn them on for one, to make sure operation is recertified. Any kind of requirements on the state level or Army Corps level. And I'm actually working with Army Corps right now to renew the one that's in Orchard Park. But yes, the turbidity, obviously because of the location of our wells, like your property, we are influenced by the well level, so surface water influencing groundwater. I mean, we're literally 35 feet away from the lake, not lookout, Dexter Reservoir. So if we were at lookout, we would have no water, you know, I'm guessing that the aquifer drained with it, but because of Dexter, and the pictures did it a really good justice, actually around the border, a majority of the sediment didn't get to, because it stayed in the main body of the, there's still a river channel in Dexter, which comes out of lookout, goes almost to the covered bridge on 58, hugs back and then comes back. So that's where a majority of the turbidity was, and that picture he put up there was perfect because it was tan, brown, and on the other side tan again. Of course, the city of Lowell's intake is in the middle of that really brown spot. We're under the pillar of the covered bridge in the old river canal. So through the summer, it benefits us. We don't get blue-green algae. We always have the freshest, cleanest water that's coming right out of lookout, right? It's not sitting in Dexter. But the exact opposite in this situation. We are getting the freshest water right out of lookout up top, you know, so. But yes, it definitely influenced him on that. Not just obviously municipal one, but also private wells.
Talk to me a little bit about how you have to change treatment based on like changes in the turbidity itself. Is that more problematic versus say a flat higher? You know, you see what I'm saying?
Right.
Let's say, just pick a number, let's say it was just 300, just
Okay.
versus 500,
500,
200, 500,
Okay.
100.
So the way we have one huge benefit, being able to slow the plant down, and the chemical that we use has a very high buffer, right? The way we operate the plant is we literally have a giant square concrete basin. And the water comes in, we add chemicals to it, we mix it really fast. I wish I brought a photo, but I
So
showed
it's like
Jeremy.
a batch. It's
Yes.
like a batch.
And it makes, I'm not, it's pretty cool to see, but it makes little floatable solids that are heavy, right? So they sink to the bottom. So what that does, it develops a blanket at the bottom of our set basin. Our set basin is 18 feet deep. We got about a 4-foot blanket. So if we go from a 30, let's say middle of the day, right? We go from a 30 heavy rain event up there and it goes to even 100, right? We have that initial blanket, which is a chemical rich blanket of previous flocks. So we have that, and then we have early indicators. We have online meters that are testing the water in the reservoir, not in the reservoir, but you know, where we pull it in and then on both sides of it. So, but to answer your question, if we had a more steady, I hate to say this, but if it was always a 300, we had a really good system in October. I mean, I had Jeremy come down the plant. If it was always 300 and we had to make no changes, not only would it reduce staff time, and it's not going to reduce chemicals, obviously,
Yeah,
that's that higher end, so electricity, chemicals, stuff
You
like
would
that.
not be adjusting.
We would not have to be, and that's the part of it. We have no automation, so when it changes, it's the guys there, you know, slowly turn on a dial, and then you give it time, grab a sample, and you look at it, and this whole time you're not making water, you're wasting. You're using the plant, but you're literally putting it to the sewer plant, because we don't discharge back to the lake, we discharge to a pump that pumps it to the sewer plant. So you sit there and you monitor it, monitor it. In a perfect world, if it was 300, you know, October 1st till January 30th, I'm not gonna say I'm gonna like it, but we can work with it. Our biggest struggle this year was tanning, and that's for a lot of people, but it's an organic that is, you know, it can be a byproduct of maple leaves, there could be many things, but it was accumulated in the silt that was in the bottom for 70 years. It got released up, and that's why we got the color through the treatment facility. It's not harmful, it's not harmless, it's just what happens. If you see a maple leaf on concrete, you pick it up, you know, it leaves that mark, that's pretty much what it did on the water. So tan is difficult. We did everything for taste and odor with carbon, we pre-chlorinated and everything else, but if the MPUs were stable and, you know, small buffer, it would make, I'm not gonna say easier, but it'd make it more consistent. It would definitely make the operations more consistent. Yeah.
Okay.
And the big spikes we had, you know, we can go up to 10,000 MTUs. Of course, you know, it's not accurate, but we had 3 days where it was 1,000, but it was only 1,000. It was actually right after we talked. It was only 1,000 for a very brief window. I knew what you guys were doing, so all we did was just turn the plant off. Our equipment still monitors the lake condition. But yeah.
Based on all the information that you've accumulated, the situation, this mean that the next drawdown, we will not have the brownness the same, to the same extent.
No,
So it'll still be there then.
it's gonna be there, and I'll tell you guys why. if you guys have went up to Lookout, you guys clearly know it's full. It's actually full. Well, I don't know what it is today, but it was pretty dang full shortly after the actually December 12th, because we got an atmospheric river and it went up 85 feet, if I'm not mistaken. But once it got full, Lookout started settling almost immediately at the headwaters, way past Hampton Boat Ramp, right? So this end down here cleared up pretty quick because you can't see 300 feet down. Well, Lookout didn't, or Dexter didn't. It took a little bit more time. And we're still dealing with a little bit of the NTUs that got brought in from Lookout that still have the tannins and the organics and other things that make it a little bit more difficult to treat. To assume that everything that was in there came out on this last one is, there's just no way. I seen it at its lowest level. I can still see stuff. We've had conversations. I'm predicting, if you want to say overall, George, for the whole season, is it going to be less? It probably is going to be, because there was a lot sitting there.
Yeah.
But
Pretty obvious at the beginning.
I think we're gonna see the same conditions, and I'm not saying NTUs to the number, but I think we're still gonna see tannins, because remember, this body goes all the way to Oak Ridge. You know, West Fur and North Fork goes all the way to Hills Creek. There's just a lot of area, you know, the 27-mile, whatever this is a big body of water up there. Are we gonna have issues? We are. We're gonna have issues. We're probably not gonna get the permanent solution that we're hoping to get before this next drawdown cycle. We are gonna do something. We've already worked today about maybe trying to do something in the short term, but we're gonna have issues. We are gonna be better prepared because we've already opened it up to other people, not just engineering, but other people who specialize in this kind of stuff.
So, you know, the thing is too, is you probably have a better opportunity to give the public a heads up. This is likely to be coming pretty soon because of, so everybody's not going to get screaming.
In a perfect world, the citizens of Lowell would know nothing is going on except for if they looked at Dexter.
Yeah.
That's our goal, right? That's probably not gonna happen this next year, and we are gonna be full transparent, and we're gonna be the best we can. One of the things that come out of our meeting is communication. We established a very good line of communication, not with just the powerhouse, but what the plan is, you know, the next week or the following week, because nobody knows when we're going to get an atmospheric river.
Yeah.
Right. And that changes not only operations for us, but for these guys significantly when they're trying to get to that level. So I think we have a really good communication line right now, pretty open. There's, I mean, lots of emails every day. And I think as we get closer, we've talked, I think we're just going to establish something so that if something other than what plan goes on, and you know, they get the weather data a lot better than we do, you know, so if they're predicting something, just a simple email to us so that we can be prepared for it. Is it going to be perfect, George? No, it's not. I'm just telling you right now because we have no idea what to expect. You know, we all knew there was going to be turbidity when he did his presentation in 2020. That's the first thing we talked about. To what extent, we didn't know. And you can't quantify that because you can't see what's down there. So, yeah, we keep our fingers crossed and hope that, you know, chances are we're probably gonna, we're definitely gonna deal with the issue. I just hope it doesn't get through to the consumer. That's what we're planning on. We're gonna do everything we can to try to do something to fix that.
Actually, besides the electronic equipment, is there any plans or grants to expand and improve the water plant?
There is. So the first one that Matt talked about, Jeremy, and this is what the discussion we had today is the EQUAG grant. That is the emergency funding up to $1 million, full grant, no match, no cost to the citizens. It is a rapid thing. It's very fast. So it has limited on their side, limited environmental impact, all the studies you have to do to be able to do something. So it's a rapid, very fast grant. And when I say fast is 1 year, because most stuff takes 3 to 5. Everybody knows how this process works. So that is huge. We're really focusing a lot of time right now on that, and we're keeping our fingers crossed. We have very good odds that that's going to be a possibility. And of course, when we roll into construction after this 2024 year, right? We also finished a water master plan. I mean, technically last year, it went to council, been accepted by the state. We've already established the fees and we have a plan moving forward. We have had a handful of meetings already to discuss financing options to fund the project. One of them specifically is a brand new water treatment facility. However, the plan did not identify what's happening at the drawdown because our plan was started in 2019. And we used the historical data based on the previous 30 years, which, as you guys know, was an NTU at 10 or under at all times, right? So we're going to modify the plan a little bit, but yes, even if we got the financing for it today, you're still looking for the treatment plant side of things, 3 to 5 years in a perfect world. And we're just being realistic, you know. The ACWAG grant thing is something that can happen a lot sooner. My staff and I are still hoping it will happen before this next October, which is a possibility. Realistically, it's probably not gonna happen, but it could. So we do have a plan. We're gonna pursue every avenue moving forward. But for right now, we're just gonna, just like what they're telling us, we are gonna plan on it happening at least through the end of my working career. So we need to do something to deal with it. So
Just one thing to add on to that, the emergency grant project that we're doing to increase sedimentation will be useful for future water treatment plant improvements. So it won't be only useful for the next few years until the future water treatment plant is built. It'll be part of the future water.
go ahead, Bob.
One question. Has the judge or the litigants stepped up with any money to help us solve our problem?
As far as I know, no. I haven't heard anything, so I'm gonna say no. We do work with a lot of state, federal, local EPA agencies to try to do these kind of things. As everybody knows, Charlie is the reason why, and I really appreciate that, Charlie. He is the reason why that we are able to do the PLC and SCADA upgrade, and it's full entirety, not just the shrunk down version to get us by until the upgrade happens. So we have a lot of support in our corner, we really do, and we have support from Army Corps too, you know. I don't want them to look like the bad guys, you know, they're working very close with us and helping us and trying to do things also. So we have a good plan, and unfortunately, you know, things take time. It truly does. It just takes time. And if we could, we would do something tomorrow to prepare for October, you know, because we know what's coming, but it's just gonna take time, and obviously it's gonna take money, and it's gonna take money that hopefully we can get from somewhere else. That's the plan.
Maybe this is directed more towards our representative here. So if we're having all these issues with the money, treatment plans, what's the state doing? Yeah.
What the hell are we doing up here? I know, so short session, so a couple quick things, water issues are a huge topic of conversation, so I'm part of, it's the Water Caucus, it's a bicameral bipartisan group of us that we get together and we talk water issues throughout the state, both the frontier counties here, all throughout, and we have some good members on that, so I'll throw out names, because I always like to give the people that are doing good work in this area the credit. So Representative Gomber, who has Lincoln County, he is part of that. He's on Ways and Means. He put a bill forward for just water projects, and for this district, we're going to get some. We're right now at Salem, we're approving appropriations bills. So Crestwell and Cottage Grove both getting tonight for water. The water issues here and everywhere else, we're advocating as much as we can to get water out to the cities, into the smaller communities. For my district here, it's Eastern Lake County. I always advocate for the smaller communities in unincorporated populated areas. I just live in Dexter. So any chance that we get that I can advocate and that I can get money for our small communities to do this, absolutely. Sometimes through appropriation, because it is a competitive process, because not only am I, but all the other 59 other representatives are fighting for the districts, as well as the 30 other senators are fighting for the districts, as well as every agency fighting for their funding as well. So it's a competitive process. So we'll keep fighting for that. And then anytime, and City of Lowell knows, all the staff know, if it helps to have my name and signature at the bottom of the letter of advocacy, signing on to the grant paperwork, they know that I'll sign on to anything that they need. So, and if I need to make a phone call, if I need to connect with Congresswoman Hoyle for the federal side of things, absolutely, I contact her staff. We have good communications, and they know all they have to do is reach out, make requests, and stuff, do what I can for them. So it's an ongoing process. It'll be an ongoing process, and help in the way that we can. Hopefully that answers.
Yes.
Thank you. Any closing comments from the Corps? What you want to include?
Thanks for
Matt?
having us and like this, and
Max?
reach out if you have more questions, you have more, please reach out.
We appreciate your patience as we work through this too.
Yeah, we didn't even bring any tomatoes or anything.
We'll take care.
Well, and look out, I'm sorry, in Fall Creek, like, why can't you leave it up a little longer in the summertime before you have to draw it down?
Yeah, so
You have a nice recreational area there, a lot of people come through the area that want to ski and where, and I like to fish up there.
So, under the injunction, one of the operations we're doing that's not a drawdown, it's called a delayed refill. So instead of the pool starting to fill on February 1st, along its rule curve, that's why we talked about the rule curve, being full by mid-May, we keep it down. The whole idea there is that those fish will find the outlet because they're closer to the outlet, like I kind of described in the earlier talk. So it's called a delayed refill. In 2022, we implemented this, but we got super lucky because we had a really late April, May, June rain. And so I did not think there was any scenario where you'd ever see Fall Creek fill into the injunction, and actually did in 22. It was just pure, Mother Nature delivered this unbelievable rain late in the season. So what we're doing this year is we've asked for a modification, and we have to get an agreement to try to start that refill earlier. But remember, we're not starting it back in February where we would normally start it. We're going to start it in probably, hopefully, April. That'll get us a little bit higher on average, but we won't know how high because it kind of depends on what Mother Nature delivers. So it's an injunction related item. It's a court order related item. In the long-term plan, we did not identify the delayed refill as part of our long-term plan. Now, we don't know what's going to come back from the NOAA fishery in that process, but we did not identify that particular operation. So theoretically, that one could go away. We don't know that yet.
I read an article about maybe 2 years ago or 3 years ago that there were 3,000 or 4,000 cormorants at the mouth of the Columbia River that were picking off these poor fish that were never there before. Because anybody decided to maybe clean out a few of those cormorants.
Here's this is. I'm talking to my own father. Tons of good advice for all the stupid things I'm doing. This is the problem. This regional salmon issue is there's 1,000 things, right? You point to the cormorants, but there's seals, there's this, there's that, there's this, more water than we've had, and it's maddening. And it makes it really, really difficult to come up with solutions that actually, sort of move the dial. Especially when something like the ocean can change the adult returns by tenfold. Just the ocean productivity alone. And so it is going to take a multi-pronged approach regionally to change these salmon numbers long term. All those things play into it, but just like I talked about with our own operations, if you're looking for that silver bullet operation, you're not going to find it. It doesn't exist. So if you go here, let me give you an example.
Everyone knew the judge to rule against the
Corps of Engineers removed terns from an island in the Lower Columbia Estuary. You know what happened? When they removed the terns, the cormorant numbers went up. Yeah. Read the article. It's a fascinating article. I mean, and my point here is that you can take these well-intended actions, and then Mother Nature comes in and does something. So my guess is if you go down there and get rid of the cormorants, you may hit them for a bit, and then likely something comes in behind it, quite frankly. And it's maddening. I mean, this is a really wicked regional issue. And I think what's really important is that society decides how they want to balance, strike this balance. Right? There's incredibly radical things you can do. And have, and then there's approaches where you're gonna kind of just move it along. And that's up to just society to decide how it's gonna be.
So it takes so long.
I'm gonna quit fishing and go.
At least the fish you can let them
Why
go.
don't you just go vegetarian, just double the time?
Yeah. Yeah, eat beans.
I mean, vegetable, you're probably got a large.
Yeah.
I want to thank everybody at the tables and everybody in the audience there for showing up. Hopefully, if your answers wasn't what you expected to hear, at least you have answers.
That's
And,
right.
you know,
Well, one of the things that all of us here spread the word to the rest of the citizens in Lowell. Everybody will have an idea what the hell is going on here. Everybody else runs around and says, well, what's this, what's that? All
Well,
they gotta do is participate.
I was gonna say, remind people, we've done our best to make available the information, so.
yeah, when next October shows up, say we've been here before and we've worked our way through it, and we're gonna do it again.
Leave the bridge. Instead of
Okay.
putting it on the.
Charlie Conrad's still back there, if you wanna beat him up. Core's still here.
Table and all.
We're adjourned at 8,